this place find yourself a friend. Lay down your defenses and fears. You're welcome here. Yes, you're welcome here. Yes, you're welcome here.
Good afternoon. I'm Reverend Dave Thompson, and I'm excited to bring you back to our Civil Human Bible study today. So I'm a civil human minister, and what that means is that I focus my ministry on building human peace and common ground. And in that effort, I'm looking into my own spiritual heritage to try to find those teachings that I feel in the teachings of Jesus can be applied across the board to all humans, regardless of our faith, regardless of our different politics, regardless of our different lifestyles. I truly believe that there are some beautiful teachings that we can apply as human beings today. So let's go ahead and jump into the passage. We're going through the book of Matthew right now, and we're in chapter 22, starting in verse 40. And beginning with verse 41, actually. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" They said to him, "The son of David." And he said to them, "How then does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool'? If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son?" And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day on did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. So what on earth is that all about? This particular question is one that has been difficult my whole life. I have focused on this question because it's a question that Jesus is asking of the Pharisees that ultimately is going to determine whether they believe that Jesus or the Messiah that's going to come is in fact the Son of God, or if he's just the son of David, the offspring of a long lineage of kings. And that question today, in my life 2,000 years later, has been one that has been perplexing and complicated and debatable, and something that is difficult to talk about in our modern scientific society. I want to talk a little bit about why this particular question that Jesus asks. This is the first time that Jesus asks a question of those people who are kind of attacking him right now. And why is it that he asks this particular question? And why does it seem at the end of it, did they just stop talking and feel so much pressure that they didn't want to ask him any more questions? There's a reason for that, and I want to bring that out in this passage. Let's go ahead and walk through a little bit of this passage to figure out what's going on back then 2,000 years ago in an ancient society that looks very little like our own. So right now, Jesus is sitting in what's called the temple, which is this huge building in the capital city of Jerusalem in Israel, up in the Middle East. And he's sitting there on one of the most important times and holidays of the year for Jewish individuals, even today. And he's sitting there during Passover, is what that particular holiday is called. And it's a time when hundreds of thousands of Jewish individuals would migrate in pilgrimage to Jerusalem and to the temple to actually do their sort of annual sacrifices and rituals and take care of anything that they might owe as far as a debt to God, because this is really their courthouse. They also came here to get together with people and to celebrate their history and to listen to different teachers teach in the temple. And that's why they're in the temple right now. And this is what's going on at the moment. Jesus, as a rabbi and as somebody who has drawn a significant amount of crowds, is somebody who is providing for the people a conversation, some education. And so his religious leaders, the guys who are in charge of basically religion in their country, and for that matter, politics, they are there and they are upset with him. They do not like Jesus at all, because Jesus represents something that is completely against the religious establishment of the day. Rather than going through all of the credentials and the politics and the ritual of these religious leaders that they held, Jesus instead, in his ministry, goes directly to the people, goes to the untouchables, goes to the poor, to the destitute, to, in their days, the people who would be insane or who have mental disabilities. These are the people that Jesus goes to. He doesn't go through the religious system, and that's what's upsetting to them, because with Jesus' popularity, because so many people love him, because he's helping the people who really need help, it's upsetting to the system because it makes them look like individuals who could care less about the poor, which unfortunately really was the case. Or at least they thought they cared about the poor, but they really didn't. And actually, the next chapter in our studies is going to be one that's going to be fascinating, because we're going to talk about how the Pharisees and the religious leaders of 2,000 years ago have many similarities to our religious leaders today. But let's jump into what's going on right now. Jesus, for the first time in this particular instance of being in the temple, asked the religious leaders a question. And particularly, he points it to the Pharisees, who are basically one of the larger religious groups. And they're ones who specialize in being perfect and living a perfect life according to the culture and the rules of their religion. And so Jesus asked them a pretty simple question. The Messiah, whose son is he? Now, this means a lot, and it's a very political and religiously charged question that Jesus is throwing at them. And I want to unwrap that a little bit to give us some picture of what was really being meant and what those people would have heard when Jesus said that. So what is a Messiah? We've talked a little bit about this, but essentially the kingdom of Israel is waiting for this individual who's been talked about and who's been seen as somebody who's going to save the country, to bring them to a place of greatness again, to give them freedom from the Romans, who at this time currently control them. Israel is under the Roman Empire at this time. So they are looking for a savior, somebody who's going to save their country, turn it around, bring it back to what they considered great at that time. And so this person has become a bit of a controversial issue in their society, because right now there are a number of people who are actually wanting to be seen as the Messiah. Jesus isn't the only person who is making claims about being a king or making claims of being a political leader even. But what he is different, very different than all the other ones, because he has a substantial following, because he ministers and helps the poor and those that nobody wants to help. So this Messiah person is somebody that they're waiting for. And this Messiah was supposed to be the son of the lineage of David, who is their second king, but the most well-known, the most well-loved, a great portion of the Old Testament, that is like the first half of the Bible, is written about him, a very large segment. He's the one who writes a lot of the book of Psalms, which are these like poetic verses. He was a singer and he was a musician. And it was this story, you may have heard of David and Goliath, where David is the one who uses basically a sling and defeats Goliath, this massive warrior from the enemy side, and becomes king. And so this Messiah is supposed to come out of his lineage. Now here's what Jesus is doing. Everybody knows that this Messiah, this king, is supposed to come from David's lineage. But the question is he just David's son, or is he the son of something more substantial, the divine son? This term Messiah, when we hear the word Christ, you hear the term Jesus Christ. Well, Christ isn't like his last name. Christ is actually a title that is designated, which means Messiah or anointed one, or essentially king. Because in that day and age, the way that they sort of designated who was the king in their societies. They would pour oil over them and anoint them. And so the person who was anointed was the one that was chosen by God to become king. And so that's where we get the name from. So Jesus is asking this question, okay, is he the son of David, or is he a son of somebody else? And then he basically says this verse to them that all of them would know. These Pharisees, they would all have known this verse. Jesus says that David writes, and he says in the Spirit, and basically that just means that, inspired by God. That David says that you will sit at my right hand and you will be my Lord. And there's this term Lord used several times. The fact that we know he's talking about the Messiah person, this king, because he's sitting next to God's right hand, which means that he's like a prince or a part of the monarchy of God. So what is Jesus implying here? He's implying that this Messiah is not only the son of David, but is son of God. This word Lord that is used there is one that is used oftentimes in the Old Testament and in the Hebrews past to talk about to use in place of God's actual name, which is Yahweh. So they use this term Lord, which also means like master. It describes somebody who owns or rules over a particular area. This term is essentially the one who's in charge. And in this case, this particular word also implies that this is one who's in charge on behalf of God. So what does this all mean? What on earth is Jesus implying? And why are the Pharisees just completely shut down because of it? Jesus is making a point that this particular Messiah is not just a human, but is somehow divine, whether inspired, whether part of the chemical makeup, who knows, right? But the idea is that Jesus is claiming that and asking them, which do you think? Is he human or God? Now, this is why the Pharisees stop. This is why the Pharisees don't answer this question. Because if they say it's just the son of David, then they have to basically dismiss these scriptures that Jesus is reciting to them, which are important to them, and they have to recognize. So then they look like they don't know what they're talking about. But if they do say that this Messiah, this king, is also divine, or in some way is considered a representative of God, then they have to acknowledge that they've got to submit to this Messiah. Then they're acknowledging that it's more than just an individual who's going to continue the line of Israel and the way that things have been done. This is an individual who's going to speak on behalf of God. And they haven't had anybody like that since the very beginning, Moses. So Jesus knows that they're stuck. They can't answer the question. And that's frustrating. And the people know it too. And they're kind of waiting for the Pharisees to answer, but they don't. Now, why is this important? Right? What does it mean to us 2,000 years later? Or does it even mean anything? Do we need to pay attention to this phrase? Is it important that Jesus is actually divine or not? I want to take just a couple of minutes to talk about this. This conversation obviously requires a substantial amount of conversation, but there are a couple of things that I think that we can just nuance and think about today to give us just a jumping off point to converse about this issue and talk about how it applies to us today as human beings. So as a human being, I'm approaching these scriptures just like you, reading a book that is written 2,000 years ago by people I've never met, by people that there's no YouTube video to see them. There's no way for me to communicate with them. There's no way for me to know that what they've written is actually a true account. There's no way for me to verify historically that all these things transpire the way that they're written. I have to be honest and say that. That is honest. That is the truth. But does that mean that it completely needs to be dismissed? Does it mean that the question of divinity or the question of inspiration of this person in this account doesn't matter? No. Because just because it's difficult for us to believe it, because it's supernatural or it makes claims that don't seem scientific or reasonable to us, doesn't mean that it didn't happen. We cannot, if we're going to be intellectually honest, if we're going to be scientific, then we have to be open to the possibility of some more substantial being demonstrating itself as such to us by doing something we can't do. That's being honest. So the question here is Jesus divine? And can we know it? And like I said, this is a huge conversation that could go down a massive conversation. And no doubt has been something that has been conversed to the ends of the times coming forward. And we know that it's been chatted about forever since Jesus came on the scene. I do want to submit one thought to you. Just one. What if Jesus was in fact divine in some measure? I'm going to borrow a little bit from Star Trek here, if you don't mind, a little science fiction. Who's to say that there isn't a more advanced being out there who's had some measure of creating us or some measure of participation in our development as a species? Who's to say that that particular being can't, in fact, come down in the form of a human being and to be able to do the things that Jesus is able to do for them in an ancient society? We can do a lot of those things. And if we went back in time to that ancient society and do the stuff that we did, we would be seen as a god in many ways. So it's possible in my esteem, and this is why I want to submit it to you, although not something that we see every day, and it certainly is something of science fiction at the beginning, but is possible. And that is that maybe Jesus was a divine individual. Maybe there's some way that this advanced being or species of God can store itself in the cloud and knows how to interface that human body with the cloud, and so therefore somehow able to utilize a human body to actually do divine things. Who knows, right? I'm just speculating here because this is the matter of science fiction, because we don't have any way to prove that or to do it ourselves. But they did it in Star Trek, right? And we didn't have a problem with it then. We're like, okay, yeah, no, a few hundred years in the future, sure, why not? Why not? We're traveling around through space at that point. We come to a different planet. There's life in other planets, and there's an ancient civilization. And they see Picard, and Picard as Jean-Luc Picard, the captain, right? And they see him as this magical being that needs to be worshipped. And the whole point of this episode is that, you shouldn't interfere with developing nations. And why am I bringing this up? Because today, here and now, we can't dismiss the miraculous just because it's miraculous. I love my atheist and agnostic friends. I love them so much. And I absolutely adore our conversations together. There are many, unfortunately, not all of them, but there are a few who are adamant about not even considering the miraculous, about not even considering this because it is not something that we've ever seen before. We can't reproduce it as science, and so therefore we can't consider it. I don't believe that's the case. I believe that there is an important aspect of intellectual honesty that requires us to keep our minds open to view things that we can't yet do. Now, all of that to say this, regardless of whether we believe that Jesus was divine, whether we believe that he was God, whether we even believe that he did exist, what does matter are the teachings that he taught. The teachings that have been recorded here in this book, that for 2,000 years have been just wreaking in some ways havoc on culture, but also producing the most important developments in our society, in our ability to live as humans together peacefully. And I believe wholeheartedly that these teachings of Jesus are beautiful and that they possess an ability that we need to employ today. The virtues of Jesus: compassion, forgiveness, humility, long-suffering. These are a benefit to us in our society. You and I know this as human beings. set aside our religion, our politics, and our lifestyles, we know that it is better to be merciful than to just exact revenge. We know that we enjoy people who are humble rather than those who brag about themselves. We know that we want forgiveness and that we want to live in a society of peace. These teachings are important. And that's actually why I'm going through my own religious background to try to find those things that I feel are usable to us today. I want to leave with that. I know we've talked about some really big conversations today. I appreciate your patience with it. I appreciate you giving me thought, giving me your time to consider these issues. And whether or not we consider our own religious definitions to be that Jesus is the divine person, or that is not, or that somebody else in some other history has that. What we do need to do as human beings right here, right now, when we have the most and greatest divisions that we have ever seen on our globe right now, when we're trying to figure out how to live together in peace, we've got to look to our experiences and these types of teachings to help us remember how and why we live in a peaceful society and we want to find common ground. Thank you for joining me today. I so much appreciate your time, your consideration on these thoughts. I appreciate your comments. Please do leave them in the comments below the video. I know that I and other people really appreciate them. You are the only person in this entire universe who can think and provide thought in the way that you can. No one else can do that in this world. So I would love it if you would give us that gift. So until tomorrow, when I see you again live at noon, I want you to know that I love you. And I hope you choose to love yourself. It's the only love in this world that we have any control over. And now I invite you to join me as we go about the rest of our day, loving those around us the same way. Thank you.